Wall Street, the particular 6 banks, or the largest 6 banks in the United States, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, are paying $110 billion of fines for frauds and other crimes they've committed on the way to today, on the way to pre-financial crisis, through the financial crisis, and since the financial crisis. And that's just 6 banks. They are also buying hundreds of billions of dollars of their own stock with the money that you have provided them. Nowhere in any of those equations does helping Main Street actually rate. So that's one of the reasons. There's a very clear pattern of what happens to people on the ground, their political decisions, geopolitics, trade alliances, that tie back to that moment, that tie back to the Federal Reserve making a unilateral decision to start a quantitative easing policy that they might not have known was going to ultimately be $4.5 trillion on their book, and $5.5 trillion on the European Central Bank book, and $5 and counting trillion of quantitative easing on the Bank of Japan's books, and $800 billion on the Bank of England, and so forth. They might not have known to what extent what they called an emergency policy was going to evolve, but 10 years into that emergency, those numbers are continuing to grow. Quantitative easing is not over. The fact that the Fed is talking about tapering their book, and they have by less than $200 billion out of $4.5 trillion, so not really a lot. And while they have done that, the other central banks have upped their purchasing of assets. So net, there's a straight line up in terms of the current path of quantitative easing. So regardless of what happens in the news, regardless of what some of these leaders say about their economies and how this process has worked and how it's finally working and how it's going to work and all the different ways that they project success, the reality is this emergency process is still going on. China at the time, because it had started to criticize the Fed's policy, also started to use its funding power, its central bank, its connection of its central bank, the People's Bank of China, to its government, to push the policies of China, which had to do with creating trade alliances and development alliances with countries that had had them more strongly with the United States. So going into this period as a result of the crisis and their criticism of the dollar, of U.S. policy, and in particular the post-financial crisis subsidizing of the banks by the Fed policy, they started funding and developing relationships throughout Central America and in particular with Brazil. And that started to change alliances in general throughout the world, because the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, had kind of just been a concept up until that point. It was a concept actually termed by a Goldman Sachs person a number of years before that to really label it as a sort of place to sell securities. I mean, it was sort of like, we'll just label them, we'll have a tag team sort of deal with these countries, we'll call it an acronym, and we're good to go. But this acronym, in the wake of the financial crisis, started becoming a real live thing. And in that real live thing, it started accumulating funding and financing and more political clout and economic clout as it grew throughout the world. And so the BRICS countries started having, like this, smaller and then bigger and bigger and bigger meetings amongst themselves, to the extent where the original meetings that happened in Brazil to create an alliance between the BRICS countries on a monetary policy basis, on an economic basis, on a trade basis, became what started as like a 40-person meeting in the wake of the financial crisis, a 4,000-person conference in India, one of the countries last year. So the development of other alliances in the wake of the monetary policy that the Fed created and exported to sort of the G7 countries started to and accelerated in shifting sort of world alliances. So Japan, for example, second to last chapter in my book, is very interesting to me because they are in this process of being caught because of all this monetary policy decision-making and the 10 years of connection to the Fed. They are in this process of developing alliances with China that they never had before, and alliances in the region that they never had before, as well as continuing to try and nurture the alliance that they have with the US. And this is not even just on monetary policy, this is on trading policy. So the impact of the criticism of monetary policy of the non-G7 central banks to the G7 central banks is actually shifting alliances even within the G7.